What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to week 2. I'm really happy to be here today. I hope everybody had the chance to watch last week's discussion on shame, because we're going to really build off of what we talked about last week, put that into the process this week, because this week is all about how to heal it. What do you do when you're triggered, or when something comes up, a fear or these old limiting beliefs come up and they impact how you feel about yourself? How do you manage that, and what are you supposed to do to be able to get yourself into a better place? And so I love talking about this topic. Again, like I discussed last week, this is something that's important to me personally, because I know what it's like to feel shame, as we all do. But I've studied and learned as much as I could about shame, and I'm always trying to learn new things. And so I want to share with you some of the things that I have learned with regard to shame and how to be able to help people process through it. And I think there's a couple of different techniques that we want to talk about. Well, actually, there's 5 that I wrote down, 5 or 6. No, maybe more. I've got a handful of things that you can try. I know everybody likes to work through things differently, so I hope that at least one of these will stick for everybody who's listening. So part of what I want to do today is start off by talking about kind of like the theory of this and how to heal it. And so let me share my screen. I wrote a little, before I do that. So the idea is that shame, our emotions, our fears, our values, our core beliefs, the idea is that those things reside in like the unconscious part of our minds. And then another way to think about it is just everything that's outside of our awareness. Because if you think about, if you had to learn how to walk or how to pay attention, how to drive, or how to eat, it just takes way too much brain power for it to focus on those mundane things over and over again. So the brain has it has a process to be able to put everything it can on autopilot. It doesn't want to have to think about these small tasks, because the brain is the most energy expensive part of our body. So every small thing that it can put into the background, it will. And so shame, and like I said, these limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves, those are tucked away in the background. And even if consciously we don't believe them, even if up here it's like, no, I know I'm a good person, but again, down here, I just, it doesn't feel like it. That's because shame is in the background, and it's a different part of the mind than the conscious mind. And so the thing that's so important with shame to understand is that because it's in the background, we need to reach it in the background. So many of the conscious things that we try to do don't seem to have that big of an effect because we're coming at it from the wrong angle. So today I want to talk about some of the ways to be able to address it that can more easily help it shift. I know sometimes people like doing affirmations, and they can be helpful, but I think that's a conscious way to try to address an unconscious problem. And so, yes, there is, of course, a place for positive thinking and telling ourselves good things about ourselves. Like, we need to have that. But for people who have done that over and over again and still find themselves stuck in shame, again, part of the reason why is because you're trying to address it through it's like a long cut, addressing it through the conscious way instead of going directly to the unconscious. And so I drew up this little diagram here. I'll share it with you. And when we're trying to address shame, this is when I'm working with people in a therapy setting. And if I know that people are, and this is like the most common thing that I see when people are coming into session, it's shame comes up, and it creates these opportunities for people to do things that they really wouldn't want to do otherwise. And when we feel shame, that's when we get upset and lash out or act out or numb out or do all these things that, again, are counter to what we actually want to be doing. And so if you look at this diagram here, this is like the theory, if you will. This is the lens I'm looking through whenever I'm meeting with somebody. I remember, maybe one quick little side story. I remember when I was in school, my professor, she talked about a case that she was working with. We were doing like a group consultation session. And she just went on and on about all the traumas that this lady that she was working with had been through. She talked about how just like multiple situations of abuse, her husband struggles with an addiction, verbally abused, emotionally, sexually, like this, and kind of went into details of all the things that she'd experienced, like this timeline of trauma. And as I'm sitting there as a student, I just think, like, how am I supposed to even wrap my mind around that? Like, what does that all mean? How do you categorize those things in a way that you don't feel stuck when you're working with that person? Because if you go through and try to talk about every single one of those events, therapy will last 10 years. And nobody wants to spend 10 years in therapy. And again, like for myself, like I'm obsessed with finding the fastest way possible to help people because nobody wants to stay in therapy forever. And I want to see results for people as well. And so again, as a student, I was just thinking, how in the world am I supposed to make sense of all of this? And as I've learned, I've figured out finally how I can most effectively work with somebody to be able to categorize those things so we can get results quickly. And so this is the way that I look about it, the way that I look at it. So I think about the first thing, there's an event, right? We have some kind of event, and so many of the events that we experience in life are actually neutral. And of course there are painful ones, and of course there are, nice ones as well, but much of what happens is neutral, but it gets filtered through a belief. These are the beliefs in the unconscious, these are in the background, based on all of our experiences, based on our experiences growing up. And we can talk about a little bit more about where those come from if that would be helpful. I know last week was devoted to that. Is like, where do these beliefs come from? This event is filtered through a belief, which then there's this splitting off here. Depending on what you believe about yourself or about the world, a very different chain of events occurs. And so the first one, let's say the event is my kids are fighting. I think parents have this, there's no way to avoid this when kids fight. So that's the event. It gets filtered through this belief. And let's say my belief is shame. I'm a bad mom or dad. I'm a bad parent. My kids are fighting. I'm a bad parent. If I think to myself that I'm a bad parent, or on an unconscious level, if I believe I'm a bad parent and this event is a reflection of that, the thing that happens next is we have an emotion. We're going to get angry, we'll get sad, we'll feel worthless, we'll get hard on ourselves. Emotionally, it's just going to feel very painful, anxiety. And then as a result of that emotion, we're going to act in this way. There's an action. I'm going to yell at them, or I'm going to fly off the handle and take away everything that I can think of, or I'm going to just do something that's disproportionately in response to this event. So the event, kids are fighting, but if we, again, get off balance emotionally because of this belief, everything else suffers. And the opposite is true. If you're looking at this event, the kids are fighting, and it gets filtered through this positive belief of I'm a good parent, kids fight, that's what happens sometimes, I'm still a good parent, the emotions that I'm going to feel are going to be so different. I'm going to feel confident, I'll feel optimistic still, like, I'm in control, I feel like I can come up with I can either access the resources that I need, or I can come up with ways to be able to respond because I know I'm a good parent. And that's just, kids fight, but I can handle this. And then as a result of those positive emotions, and sure, of course, we can get frustrated, we can get upset too, but it's a different feeling than when it comes from shame. It's disproportionate in shame. But when we're coming from a solid place emotionally, in terms of our belief, the emotion is going to be more solid, and the action is going to be more appropriate. So for example, an appropriate response might be separate the kids. It might be take something away. It might have a discussion for them. Whatever the situation calls for, which is what I mean when I say appropriate, that's what we can more easily do when we're not having these events filtered through this negative belief of shame. And so now when I look at, when I'm working with clients, going back to that experience that I had when I was in school, you can put any event in here, like all the abuses, all the neglect, the rejection, you can put that all under the event thing. And when I'm working with people, I always try to figure out what, as a result of that event, do they believe about themselves? And sometimes it's a single incident, like a significant trauma that creates a negative belief. Many times for many people, it's a lot of small instances. It's a lot of like little rejections or neglect or other experiences like the wounds that we talked about last week. It's those small things that add up. But again, as I'm looking at it through this lens, I'm always figuring out what is the result of those experiences in terms of their beliefs about themselves. And so as you are thinking about this as well, thinking about what do I believe about myself as a result of what I've experienced, and recognizing that that's the thing that filters all of our experiences is our beliefs. And so, like I said, as I if I could go back to my the younger version of myself rather, in school, I would categorize it in this way. All these things happened to this lady. My question is, what's the belief about her? And all of these things are again a result of that. So often people try to do it backwards. They think about this action. I got to stop yelling at my kids, or I've got to stop lying, or I've got to stop numbing out, or insert whatever action they're trying to get away from. And then they say, I just need to bite my tongue a little bit better. I just need to, I don't know. They come up with some kind of solution specific to this action. And while there's a place for that, it takes so much longer going backwards. Like you start here, then you try to again, dampen this emotion. Well, I shouldn't be so angry at my kids. And we get hard on ourselves. And then we try to just go backwards, but eventually we find ourselves stuck again. Some event happens, the belief filters it, and then we feel awful again. And so a part of what I want to share today is, how do you do it? How do you address this in a way that you can most easily resolve the issues that you feel? So again, going back to this example, if you want to stop yelling at your kids, one of the fastest ways to be able to do that is to relieve yourself of shame. Or again, insert whatever action is here. So instead of working backwards and trying to grit our teeth and just control our emotions more effectively, starting here, starting at the belief, then moving forward, what's the belief about ourselves that we want to replace it with? Once that's in place, you already have a positive filter that experiences flow through. Then naturally, the emotions are going to be more positive. Then naturally, the actions are going to be more positive. And so again, this is getting to the subconscious or the unconscious level, changing the belief system there, and then everything else is positively flows from that. So, okay, let me shift back here and get into some of these techniques for you. The first one that I was thinking about is awareness. And this might not sound like so much of a technique, but awareness is crucial, because if you don't understand that shame is separate from you, your belief system is separate from you, it's so easy to beat ourselves up and think it's us and there's something wrong with us. Again, I quoted Tony Robbins last time. He's like, he focuses on this as well. He says, what do you focus on? And when you focus on these negative thoughts that show up, he says that it's these negative thoughts of I'm not enough, there's something wrong with me. All these shame thoughts are a result of this 2 million year old brain that we have. And he says, if you think about it, those thoughts, I was at this event, again, there's 9,000 people there, and he says, everybody raise their hands. Who has ever thought one of those thoughts? And every hand goes up, of course, because we all have. And he wanted to make a distinction here, and he says, that is because that's the mind. He says, that's not your mind, that's just the mind, that's the brain doing what it does. It's wired. The number one job of our brain is to keep us alive. And the way to do that is to focus on threats, to focus on danger, to focus on what's wrong, to avoid, and so we can stay safe. And it doesn't, in so many areas of our life, it doesn't serve us well. In our relationships, if that's the filter of our brain, is think about, well, what's wrong? What ways are my partner letting me down? What ways is he or she not showing up for me? Our brain is wired to do that. And his point with all of this is that is just the mind doing what it does, and that's separate from you. And for me, that's such a huge thing that helped me out. I remember, again, my experience, having experienced this myself in my teens, just in case, I guess a little recap of what we talked about last time. In my teens, just feeling down. I don't know what was going on. But in grad school, I learned about this idea of shame, and just the sheer awareness of shame and what it was totally helped to separate myself from it. And immediately the grip of how bad it felt went away. And this is something that served me, and it continues to serve me. And so I think about this as being one of the first strategies that we should put in place, is the awareness of the feeling and the awareness that the thoughts that we have are not us, the feelings that we have are not us, and those beliefs that we have are actually not true. And so though just the awareness doesn't overnight shift it for people, because those beliefs are in the background, it helps to loosen the grip. That's kind of what I experienced. Not that those things disappeared, but dramatically shifts in the moment. And even present day, if a negative thought comes into my mind, or if I am critical of somebody else in my head, or if I do something that's contrary to what I want to be doing, I can tell myself that's just a thought. I don't have to follow that. I don't have to believe it. I don't have to do anything with it. It's just a thought. Whereas in the past, if I thought a negative thing about somebody, I beat myself up and say like, well, does this mean I'm not a good person? I'm not being nice. Now it's just thought shows up. Okay, that's a thought. Change gears, shift it, change the channel rather. And so the awareness is something that's so important. One other thing that I wanted to share was, we'll go to the next step number 2. We hear so much about this idea of gratitude. And I want to share something that I learned, which was a different perspective for me, which helped. It helped motivate me to be able to want to do this more. Because if you think like, oh, just like be grateful for your blessings, be grateful for all the good things in your life, don't focus on the bad things. Those are all cognitive exercises. That's a cognitive, conscious approach to when you feel shame or when you feel bad. And so I want to, again, share this little picture here with you. There's an organization, actually, let me explain it first. There's an organization called HeartMath, and they study the impact of emotions on us, and they have strategies for bringing us back to more positive states. And so one of the studies that they did, which is fascinating, they monitored people, the heart rates of people when they were feeling angry, stressed, frustrated, and grateful. And I want to show you the diagram of one of the, if I can find it here. So they showed a diagram of what we experience when we, here we go. When we experience anger and frustration and tension in our body, our heart rates respond like really negatively. And there you go. Okay. So our heart rates, there's a natural rhythm to our heartbeats. And if our hearts are in sync with the rest of our body, if we're relaxed, if we're calm, if we're in a positive state, there's a very different image of what that looks like. So looking at the top one here, anger. So looking at how jagged this is, it's not supposed to be this jagged. It's not supposed to be this irregular, these beats in between. There is a natural irregularity in between. Like no heartbeat is the exact same length in distance. Like it's not just like 0.5 seconds each time. There's a natural variation with that. But in anger, it's so dramatic and it's so like it spikes, which represents, again, the quality of our emotions, and it represents the impact that it has on our body. Again, even relaxation is a different heart rate, and it's still, there's got some jagged edges to it. But the thing that was so fascinating to me, and there's another diagram that I saw, I don't have it pulled up, but it had, I'll just maybe finish this here. So the heart rate, when we experience appreciation, it's so fluid. There's so much more coherence, or in other words, there's so much more congruence with our emotions in our body, more so than any of these other negative emotions that we feel. It doesn't have the same impact on us. And there was another diagram from HeartMath that I saw, which is cool. It showed an EEG and an EKG. So an EEG, what monitors your hearts, or is it the other way around? It is EEG is monitoring the brain waves. EKG is the heart waves. And so when people are in appreciation, those heart waves are like in sync with the brain waves. Whereas if you were to look at the anger and the relaxation, or let's focus on the anger one, anger and frustration. So they're so jagged. And so the heart rates and the heart waves and the brain waves are so disconnected and jagged as well. And we feel that physically. But appreciation is something that levels everything out. And you get this like synchronous wave in between the two, and it shifts how we feel. And so there's an exercise that that Tony Robbins does, and I'm going to post a link in the chat box for you so you can practice it as well. The idea is that instead of like just thinking about these nice things or telling ourselves to be grateful, there's a way for you to actually get in touch with that feeling, to create that feeling in the moment. And once you feel that feeling, you can't be angry and grateful at the same time. You can't be frustrated and grateful at the same time. Or you can't be in shame and feel grateful at the same time. So instead of doing a conscious cognitive exercise, like reminding ourselves of like this laundry list of good things, we can actually go into the feeling, feel it, change how we feel, and then that again not only results in a different change in our body, but it also helps us to move away from that sense of shame. So I want to post that. It's cool. I've done that with multiple people, and it feels good. So that's let's see, that's gratitude. That's number 2. Number 3. Oh, let me actually explain this. So I wrote down this note here. So in the audio, you're not going to actually see him in person. You're just going to hear the audio. He's going to walk you through it. It's like a 10 or 15. It's a 15-minute exercise. And what he does in the very beginning, he has you want to. He says if you change your physiology, that helps to interrupt the old patterns. So if we're stuck in this like shame state, our shoulders are down, we're just feeling like depressed, and so he says in order to like snap that, in order to interrupt that pattern, you have to physiologically change what's happening. Because again, if our like posture is like this and we're sitting down or we're laying down, he has you stand up like in this particular exercise. When you hear him, he'll say, put your arms above your head. And what he's going to do is have your arms up, and then you're going to do that a bunch of times. He'll walk you through it, but I want to at least demonstrate that so you know what he's doing so you can follow along when he's doing it. And again, it just helps to interrupt the pattern, and then he sinks you into this exercise of gratitude. So it's cool. I would encourage you to try it. Number 3, EMDR. So EMDR is an approach that is like, I love doing EMDR with people. I'm finding there are faster ways to do it though than EMDR, but this is depending on the nature of the experience that somebody has, EMDR can be so quick and it can be so powerful. And so what EMDR is, for those, it's an acronym. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, but the shortcut is EMDR. The idea is that when we experience a trauma or a pain, or we have this negative belief, there's a charge to that memory. That's why people, like when they have PTSD or when they have like traumatic, like when they get triggered, all of those feelings in the background come straight up to the foreground. And they've done so many different studies on this where they put people in fMRI machines where they have like, they can monitor the brain as you imagine things. And they would have somebody imagine like a car wreck that they were in a few years ago. There's one study that I was thinking about. Bessel van der Kolk has a bunch of studies in his book called The Body Keeps the Score. And this is one of the approaches that he recommends as well. And so when you imagine a trauma or a painful event from the past, as they're scanning the brain doesn't know the difference between the present and the past in those moments. It re-experiences the same thing as it did when it first happened, because that's the way our body's wired. And as you think about those things, the feelings come flooding forward. And so what happens in trauma or in shame, those feelings of the past show up in the present. Again, that whole belief system, it filters our experience. EMDR is really such a cool tool to help people go into the past to reprocess these old events and take the charge out of the event so it becomes just this neutral feeling experience. It's like, yeah, I remember when my friend like stood me up and he told me I was the worst friend ever, and I just felt terrible. And if I still felt shame about that, if that reinforced that I'm a bad person or nobody likes me, I would feel it. But if I were to do EMDR with that same thing and go into the past and reprocess that memory, the charge would not exist in the present anymore. And it's such an important tool to be able to break those links for people. Because without breaking those links and so EMDR is another way to get to this unconscious level. Because it's not a thought process where you're like thinking yourself out of it. It's a way to feel yourself through it and process it differently. And there was for those of you who are listening who might be doing EMDR with a therapist, there was a training that I went to called Attachment Focused EMDR. And it's a very cool like addition to what you can do while you're doing EMDR with memory. And so I'll explain it I'll explain it briefly, because whether or not your therapist knows about it, you can like put it into your own process as you do it. So the idea is that when we are stuck in this old state, our brain just loops, and it goes from, the trauma of the event to the feeling, and then it just reinforces how painful the event was, and then we feel even worse. EMDR is designed to interrupt that pattern. And in the training that I went to, what he says is you bring in a positive, like let's say a figure, a person. Let me try to think of a recent example. So working with an individual where she just didn't feel like she was enough. And you trace that back to a memory. And once you got to that memory, this individual, let's say, for this particular client, working with her, she had difficulty with her mom growing up, and she never felt like she was good enough. She always felt like she was failing. Mom was always upset with her, which reinforced I'm such a bad kid. And she always felt just like isolated. And so as we were doing EMDR, we had that scene in mind for her. And what we did was we brought in a different person. And it's this like visualization where you bring in somebody that has a positive connection with you, or somebody that has like, it's like a positive resource for you. And we imagine this person coming back to this young version of her, where she was able to reassure her, was able to comfort her, was able to hold her in her mind's eye. She's imagining all this happened, this person coming back. I think it was a friend. Her friend came into the scene and did all those positive things for her. And again, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the brain doesn't know the difference if you visualize something or if you experience it. And so when you're in this kind of like almost this trance, it's not even a trance state, but like this ultra relaxed like state that EMDR puts you in, you're able to bring in this other person to reassure you. And as you imagine that, the body responds and it calms down. And then as the body calms down and as you hear these positive messages, the intensity of the experience diminishes. And so you can go with this in like so many different ways. You can imagine friends or family or spiritual figures or anybody that you can think of, bring them into the scene to help you and give you what you needed at that moment, whether it was comfort, whether it was wisdom or protection or any number of things that you could have used in the moment that you felt hurt. EMDR, putting this additional piece into it, it speeds up the process for people. And then again, it's not that you're just like telling yourself, well, yeah, I'm an important person, or yeah, she would tell me that if I was around. You go inside and you feel that, and you're able to associate that positive feeling with the old negative event. And so as you're doing this, as you're reassociating this old event with a new positive feeling, that positive feeling overrides and then starts to, it like filters in it, and it like injects this positivity into this old memory. And then when you think about the old memory, it has a different resolution to it. That's probably the best word for it. As you are reprocessing it through bringing in people that are supportive and imagining a different ending to the scene, it's not that you're, again, changing the past, but you're able, by doing that, you're reprocessing it differently and injecting a new meaning and a new feeling into the old event, which then neutralizes it. Again, it's such a cool thing. Maybe I'll share one more quick experience I was working with. This works with other just random like triggers as well. I was working with a lady who was struggling with, she was a teen rather, struggling with eating disorder. And she was afraid she was going to get fat and didn't want to eat. And so food was linked with, I'm going to get fat, and which there's shame there. And she didn't want to be, for fear of what people would think and not feeling like she'd be accepted and have friends. So the food was negatively paired with shame. And so again, through the EMDR process, you're able to go in, and what I worked with her on was I wanted to create a new positive association with food. Kind of like Pavlov's dog, if you remember that experiment that he did. So he rang the bell. He had a dog. He rang the bell, put food in front of the dog's mouth, and then the dog salivated. So he paired the bell with food. He did that enough to where anytime he rang the bell, the dog would just start to salivate, even if there was no food around, because those two things, he had conditioned the dog to have that response. And so it is with us on our unconscious level. We're conditioned to feel shame during certain experiences. So for her, it was linked with food. And so what we did was I had her imagine food, and I linked that with something that she wanted, which was energy, because she liked being outside. And so I said, okay, I want you to imagine a plate of food and having this like glow, this warm glow of light. And then I want you to imagine eating the food. And when you eat it, I want this light to fill your entire body and like have this surge of energy course throughout your veins. And we spent some time kind of filling that out to get her into the feeling. But after we did that for, I think it was like 1 or 2 sessions, this was like surprisingly fast for her. There was a completely different shift for her. And she said that she could eat now, and it didn't have the same effect anymore. Because again, which speaks to the power of EMDR, getting to the unconscious, she knows like, yeah, food's important for energy. But as you go into this process and you visualize it, and again, as you're doing the EMDR process, somehow it opens up the network in your mind in a different way and allows you to pair old triggers with new positive emotions or meaning, which then changes how everything plays out. So I just want to share a couple of examples just to get your mind going in that direction in case that's something you want to do with the therapist that you're working with. Okay, we've got two more. It's 3 or 4 more here. So we'll kind of pick up the pace here. Number 4, neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is an approach that's it's so fascinating to me. And I got trained in it a few months ago, and it's so cool to see people come back with the results that they experience and say, hey, I used to be super anxious, and now I'm not anxious. Hey, I used to beat myself up and say all these negative things about myself. Now when those thoughts come up, I'm able to just let them go. And so one of the reasons why I think this is important is because, so again, going back to probably the leading trauma researcher in the world, his name's Bessel van der Kolk, and he's got a clinic in Boston. He wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which I mentioned earlier. In that book, he talks about the importance of neurofeedback and how he got introduced to it, and now how his whole clinic does it. And I remember listening to a workshop that he did in Yale. He gave a lecture at Yale. And at the end of the lecture, it was on trauma. It's like fascinating research that he's been putting out there for people to understand how to better treat it. He had a Q&A, and in the question, there was like maybe 4 questions that somebody came up and said, hey, in this instance, this is what a client might experience. What would you do? How could I help him? And then another person would come up and say, well, in this case, what about this? Childhood, like chronic neglect, chronic abuse. What do you do here? There's honestly like 3 or 4 different questions that they had, and literally every single question had the answer. A part of it was neurofeedback. And so whether it's chronic abuse or neglect when you're young, or whether it's like these negative thoughts here in the present as a result of the trauma, he relies on neurofeedback for that. And it's not like a one-off thing. If you do neurofeedback and then nothing else, everything's fine. Like it's an adjunct to treatment, but it's such a powerful addition. And I wanted to mention it here. And I have another little diagram I want to show you here. So when I'm doing this with people, you do a self-assessment based on the symptoms of whatever you choose. So there can be any symptom under the sun, really. It can be depression, anxiety, overeating, undereating, lack of sleep, tension, lack of focus, like any number of things that you want to start to work on. You create like your own little sheet of 5 or 6 of them that you want to track. Then as neurofeedback progresses, you're able to, every day you do it, track the progress of it. And so let me share this with you. This was a person who, so I was working with this individual, and these were the 5 different symptoms that she chose. So lack of concentration, frequency of fatigue, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, self-depreciation, just being hard on herself. And as you look at this graph here, all of these figures here went down. Lack of concentration went from 7 to when we started. It quickly shifted the next week. And these are one session at a time. 1 session, 2, 3, 4. So as she did this course of treatment, everything went from 7, and for her, this went down to 1. Frequency of fatigue went from 10, again, all the way down to 1, which is like so cool. Degree of anxiety from a 9, degree of depression, again, a 9, low self-esteem, an 8. You can see how dramatic the shift is, and then all of them end up at 1 for her. Self-depreciation, same thing. When an 8 just kind of trickles all the way down. So I think this is just such an awesome tool for people who, to briefly explain what neurofeedback is, it's a way to train your brain to balance the levels out. And so sometimes when people are experience trauma, or when just life experience dysregulates our brain. And what happens is, if this is the baseline, and like let's say a certain part overfunctions, you're going to get like anxiety or OCD, fears, hypervigilance. Like our brain is working on overdrive, PTSD. And if the brain underfunctions in other areas, you're going to get depression, low self-esteem, low motivation, just the different difficulty in sleeping. So many of the symptoms that we experience as people are a result of the brain being dysregulated. And if the brain stays in a pattern of dysregulation, it starts to reinforce itself. And so even if you're not being, again, going back to like a case of abuse, like if you grew up in a household where there was abuse, our brain is going to get dysregulated by that. And let's say you're in a household now where you're not being abused, the brain still, for many people, can stay stuck in those old patterns because, like they say, neurons that fire together wire together. So if those neurons have been firing for years in a way that's dysregulated, now then when the situation changes, the brain doesn't automatically, okay, I'm good now, everything's fine. Like those patterns are still dysregulated, which then maintains the symptoms of depression and anxiety and self-esteem and all those things. And so as I've been doing more and more neurofeedback with people, to see people come back and say, no, I'm not as anxious anymore. Or one particular individual, she said she noticed that, like, again, negative thoughts would show up and she would be able to just let those thoughts go. And it wasn't that big of a deal. The thought would come up and then she just, it's not important. I don't have to worry about that. And she just feels less angry. And again, all of it is because when the brain is able to calm itself down and you're able to train it to do so, then those symptoms aren't being maintained constantly by the dysregulated brain. So another powerful tool, I think, in the toolbox to be able to help people with shame and other symptoms of it. Two more. The next one is reaching out. So Brené Brown, an author who talks a lot about shame, a researcher, she talks about how crucial reaching out is when you're feeling shame. And so what this might look like, let me actually even take a step back and explain why. So we as people are wired for connection with somebody else. We're wired to be able to feel support by them, to feel loved, which is very, I think, counter to the culture that we live in now, which says we should be independent. We shouldn't have to rely on other people. We should be able to meet all of our own needs. Like it's very just like, I'm okay as I am and I don't need help from other people. The truth is that's so false, because I think anybody who's a parent or has seen a child with a parent knows that if a child is able to turn to their parent to get their need met, let's say a child is upset and cries or is having a hard time, if the mom or dad is able to go, or the parent or whoever is able to go and just soothe them, comfort them, just the presence and like the caring, the touch, that slows down the child so much. Versus like, so I've been married for 5 years and we're just kind of starting out. So we have one daughter, she's 2.5. When I am able to do that with her, if she feels upset, if I can like calm her down, another important piece of research that they discovered is that even naming emotions helps to decrease the intensity of them. And so now that I know this, I'm able to, anytime, like today, my daughter like fell into the bathtub. There was no water in it, but she was like climbing around. I pick her up, I put her on my lap and I said, was that scary? That looks very scary. Are you scared? And she says, yes. But as I give her that word, not only is she able to learn what that feeling is and how to put language to that, it calms her brain down. And so we're wired to receive comfort and connection from other people, and we never actually outgrow that. So we see that easily and we accept that in children, but we accept it less in adults. But it's still such a crucial, this is one of the reasons why I love doing couples work with people, because there's ways to help them learn how to connect with each other in such a quicker way than many people do it. And once you learn how to do this, once you learn the skill of being able to reach out and you hear from a partner or you hear from a friend, hey, I get it. Me too. I feel like that as well. Hey, you yelled at your kids and you felt bad. Like I've had that same experience. It's difficult. I don't like how it feels either. Like, I'm sorry. When you're able to reach out and receive reassurance, or you hear that somebody else has gone through the same thing, shame evaporates. Because what shame tells you is there's something wrong with you and you're alone in it. Nobody else understands. And to be able to get the validation and reassurance of somebody else that they do understand, that you're not alone, shame can't exist in that. And one of the things that Brené Brown says is if you put shame in a petri dish and you inject it with empathy, it can't exist. And so as you reach out, that's one of the main ways to be able to get empathy and a response from other people, is to let them in on what you feel. And that's not always an easy thing, because shame will, like, this belief tells you I can't tell anybody else, because if somebody were to know about this, I would be rejected, which goes back again to this fundamental thing that's installed in us, is I can't be rejected, because then our brain, again, a really interesting piece of research is that when we're rejected socially, social rejection and isolation, or stepping on a nail, physical pain, I guess I use the example of stepping on a nail. It could be anything, like physical pain. Those two experiences light up the exact same part of the brain. And the reason is because we're wired for connection, and not having it is a danger cue to us, because we can't survive without it. And so if you are able to take the shame that you feel, identify it, put words to it, share it with somebody else, and ask for what you need, the reassurance or comfort or just understanding, when somebody responds in that positive way, shame will disappear. It's, again, such a powerful way to be able to get your need met in that way. Okay, the last thing I want to go over here is self-compassion. Self-compassion, I want to explain a little bit more research. I think research is so helpful because that guides me as a therapist as to what works. Because I don't want to just like throw like tools that sound cool at clients and hope it works. I want to be guided by this works and this is why it works. Self-compassion is one of the things that's so crucial as well. Like, I guess all of these things are so important, but self-compassion is something that you can condition yourself to do. Because shame, when we experience shame, we're hard on ourselves. We beat ourselves up. We tell us all the ways that we failed. We remind ourselves that, nothing we're doing is good enough, which activates the stress chemical in our brain and in our body, and then it floods it, and then we're the enemy. It triggers a fight or flight response, and we're the ones doing it to ourselves. Self-compassion is the opposite. Self-compassion, one little note, self-compassion is not like talking to yourself, like building yourself up. Oh, you're so great. Oh, you're so awesome. Don't worry about what anybody else says. You're the best. That's not self-compassion. Self-compassion is a way to be able to treat yourself in a way that you're giving yourself love and you're giving yourself a break, in other words. That's probably the easiest way to put it. You're giving yourself a break. And as you treat yourself kindly, there's a very different response that happens. And so Kelly McGonigal is a researcher who does a lot of work with self-compassion. And she quoted a study that they did at Duke University where they brought in a group of body-conscious women, and they had them eat a bunch of donuts, which they already didn't like, and they had them drink a full glass of water. So they felt like so gross, and they just hated how they felt. And so what they did, they took one group of women and gave them let me take one more step back. Before, there's two steps to the study. Number one, they had them eat a bunch of donuts and then fill them up with water. Number two, they brought out a candy dish, a bunch of candies, and they said, here, we want you to sample as many of these candies as you would like to be able to evaluate them. And so in that moment, there was a group of the women, this like the what the heck effect kicked in. It's like, well, screw it. I've already, I broke my diet, so screw it. Doesn't matter. I'm going to just gorge and binge on these candies because what the heck, it doesn't matter. I've already messed up. And so what they did was they took one group of women and they shared a message of forgiveness, self-forgiveness. And what they said was, by the way, we've noticed that you probably feel bad or guilty about eating all of the donuts that you ate. Just like you're able to, if one of the steps in this is mindfulness. So being aware, I feel guilty, I feel bad about what I've done. Being aware of that. So they offered that message back and said, you probably feel guilty about what you've done. We just want to remind you that everybody indulges sometimes. And we just want to encourage yourself. We want to encourage you not to be too hard on yourself. So this element of, again, this Me Too element that I was talking about earlier when we reach out, if we know that other people have struggled with this, it takes the sting out of it. It's like, oh, good, I'm not the only person. I'm not just like some loser who always gets it wrong. It's like, oh, other people experience this too. So they offered this message of like, be gentle with yourself. And what happened, very simple message, but the result was like astounding. And what they said was the message, the women who got the message of self-forgiveness ended up eating less than 50% as much candy as the other group who did not. And so specifically the numbers of the candy that people ate, the group that didn't get the message of self-forgiveness ate 70 grams of candy. And a gram of candy in that study was, one piece of candy was 3 grams of, one piece of candy was 3 grams. And so if you think about it, 70 grams is a ton of candy. And so the people that didn't get the message ate 70, whereas compared to the people who got the message, they only ate 28 grams. So again, less than half the amount by getting one simple message of just go easy on yourself. And I think sometimes people try to beat themselves up and use shame as a tactic on themselves or on their partners or on their kids, coming from a positive place to motivate them to not do bad things. Because again, as a parent, we want to guide our kids and we don't want them to fall into paths that aren't going to serve them. But if we use that as a tool to motivate them, it actually demotivates them. And when we use it on ourselves, it's such a hurtful thing for us that we're more likely to repeat the same behavior that we're trying to avoid in the first place. So this fits very well with people who struggle with addictions, right? If shame is such a present and prevalent element in addiction, this is why this is like, it's such a cycle, because I feel so bad about what I've done. There's something wrong with me. I'm this guy who can't get it together. I'm hurting my family. I have no control. Like this, they beat themselves up, which sets the stage for them to act out again. Not because they want to, but the pain is so intense that that's the way that they've learned how to numb it. And then they beat themselves up some more, and then they're more likely to act out some more. And so it's so important to be able to interrupt that pattern. And one of the ways to do that, again, is to be able to offer yourself a sense of compassion, which is, again, I want to highlight this. This is different than giving yourself a license to do whatever you want. That's not self-compassion. Self-compassion is, I made a mistake. I can acknowledge that this feels bad. I know that this is not something that I wanted to do. In the process of recovery, sometimes if I slip and that happens, I know this affects myself and other people, but I know I can get back on the path. I know for many people in the recovery process, there's not perfection. And so when I encounter an event where I get triggered and I don't use one of the tools that I need to use, I want to like at least offer myself a sense of like, you know what, I'm going to get back on the track, and it's okay to not be perfect. And it's okay to not be perfect. And I want to keep trying to improve. So you're not in any way licensing, oh, I did this and it's not that big of a deal because I'm okay, I'm great. It's, no, this happened. I'm still a good person, and I want to keep trying so this doesn't keep happening. And when we offer ourselves that, it helps to interrupt the pattern, which actually sets us up to not act out in the future as much or at all once you're able to fully break those links. And so there's a handful of different things. I wanted to at least highlight some of the key ones that I've been working with clients on specifically. And I hope that as you have listened to this, something stands out for you to be able to start to apply for yourself. Because the more you can incorporate these different strategies to your approach and how you handle shame for yourself, the easier it is for you to feel it less, which sets you up to feel better and breaks these old limiting beliefs that are in place as a result of the experiences that we go through. So I can speak from my own experience. It's possible for shame to be alleviated and reduced and eliminated. We don't have to keep feeling shame about the same things over and over again. We can create different meaning. We can change our belief system. We can be kind to ourselves. And so if a thought or a negative thought or a shame, a belief or something gets triggered along those lines, we can do something different with it. And as you do things differently with it, that belief system changes. And then you're not going to feel shame in the same degree or at all related to certain triggers that you used to. And so I'm excited for you to apply these tools. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them and see if any of these resonate with you. But again, I appreciate being able to spend this time with you. And we'll check in next week. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how to work with shame in your relationship. And we'll go from there. Thank you.